All right, let's dive right into this explainer. When we picture Abraham Lincoln, we usually see the towering statesman, right? The great emancipator carved in marble. But the actual historical record reveals a completely different angle. We're talking about a man who took office desperately hoping to avoid bloodshed, yet somehow evolved into this highly pragmatic, incredibly effective master of total war. Today, we're going to see exactly how he completely rewired his military command, wrangled some fiercely bitter political rivals, and used pure, practical common sense to totally shatter the rigid military dogmas of his day.
Think about this. Before he even stepped foot in the White House in 1861, a massive disunion crisis had already erupted. South Carolina was out, and all eyes were laser-focused on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. Lincoln literally had to learn on the job from day one. And I love his own self-effacing words on this. He openly admitted that events controlled him, not the other way around. He just wasn't a guy who clung to rigid long-range plans when reality was shifting beneath his feet. He preferred to react, to adapt, and to figure it out as the circumstances unfolded.
Now, it's super important to realize that Lincoln didn't just walk in looking for a fight, nor was he willing to maintain peace at literally any cost. His absolute paramount objective? Preserving the Union. And he desperately wanted to pull that off without firing the first shot. During the whole Fort Sumter crisis, his advisors were all over the place. Some said, abandon the fort. Others warned that showing weakness would destroy the Union entirely. So what's Lincoln's solution? He sends a relief expedition, but with provisions only. He tells the South Carolina governor, look, no arms or men are going in unless we're attacked. It was a brilliant move. He basically forced the Confederacy to make the first move. And when they opened fire on April 12, 1861, Lincoln finally had the clear justification he needed to call up troops, hoping the whole thing would be over quickly.
Well, as we know, it wasn't over quickly. Once those first shots were fired, Lincoln desperately needed a strategy. His general-in-chief at the time, Winfield Scott, pitched this thing called the Anaconda Plan. The idea was to avoid direct battle in Virginia, take control of the Mississippi River, and just slowly tighten a blockade to squeeze the South into submission. But Lincoln looked at this slow, passive, supposedly bloodless approach and thought, yeah, this isn't going to work. He had zero confidence in it. So he overrules Scott and pivots to his own common-sense strategy. To him, you had to actively fight the war to win it. He wanted an active, simultaneous advance, pushing on multiple fronts all at once.
What's wild here is that Lincoln had literally no formal military training. None. But he intuitively grasped the fundamental math of war. He looked at the board and realized, okay, the Union has way more troops, but the Confederacy can easily just rush their forces to defend specific single points of attack. His solution? You have to menace the enemy with superior numbers at multiple points at the exact same time, so they can't reinforce everything at once. It was just brilliant, pragmatic math.
Of course, having a brilliant plan on paper is one thing. Actually getting generals to execute it in the mud and the blood, that's a whole different story. Lincoln found himself endlessly frustrated by these overly cautious commanders who were just obsessed with rigid military dogma. Take George B. McClellan. After General Scott resigned, Lincoln puts McClellan in charge. And look, the guy was a master organizer, an absolute logistical genius. But when it came time to actually pull the trigger and attack, he constantly hesitated. Lincoln got so exasperated he famously quipped that McClellan has the slows, and eventually had to demote him after practically begging him to alter his ridiculously cautious Peninsular campaign.
And that kicks off this crazy, almost 2-year game of musical chairs, where the Union armies just completely lacked any effective unity of command. Just look at this rapid-fire succession of commanders in Virginia. We go from McClellan to Pope, right back to McClellan, then over to Burnside, Hooker, and Meade. It was chaos. Lincoln, his Secretary of War Stanton, and Chief of Staff Halleck basically became an informal war council. Lincoln is literally writing personal suggestions to generals in the field, trying to explain to them that the real goal is to destroy Robert E. Lee's army, not just to occupy Richmond. He's desperately shuffling the deck, just praying to find someone who will actually fight.
Then he finally looks out west and spots his guy, Ulysses S. Grant. Grant had just pulled off this incredibly bold, unconventional campaign at Vicksburg, Mississippi. Instead of bypassing it like Lincoln thought he should, Grant crossed the river and attacked from the rear. It was a massive success. And Lincoln's response? He sends this letter to Grant openly admitting, "You're right and I was wrong." Think about how incredibly rare that is, for a sitting president to plainly tell a subordinate they were wrong. It's an amazing display of practical leadership. It proved Lincoln valued actual results way more than protecting his own ego.
So by March 1864, the pieces are finally in place. Lincoln brings Grant in, and together they pioneer this totally unprecedented, modern high command structure. You've got Lincoln at the top as commander-in-chief overseeing the big picture. Stanton is handling the immense logistics of men and supplies. Halleck is acting as this crucial liaison, smoothing things out between the politicians and the military. And Grant is out there directing all the field armies in a coordinated offensive. It was a massive, well-oiled machine, explicitly built to harness the entire energy of the nation for total war.
But wait, it gets infinitely more complicated, because Lincoln wasn't just fighting battles down south. He was fighting a massive, messy political war back home. He had to manage deep, bitter divisions in the north, trying to wrangle what he famously called the fire in the rear. To keep the war machine running, he absolutely had to maintain popular support. And he was facing serious opposition from the Peace Democrats, or Copperheads, some of whom were actively collaborating with the Confederacy. To keep the country from tearing itself apart, Lincoln had to make some incredibly tough, highly controversial calls, like suspending the writ of habeas corpus and authorizing temporary arrests just to prevent real, palpable injury to the military effort.
And this brings us to what might be Lincoln's absolute political genius, his cabinet. He inherits the old spoils system, but he uses it to hot glue a very fragile coalition together. He intentionally packs his inner circle with his fiercest political rivals from the 1860 Republican nomination. He basically ensures that every single major party faction has representation at the highest level, deliberately throwing men into the same room who were entirely antagonistic to one another.
Within his own party, he's constantly playing this impossible balancing act between two extreme factions. On one side, you have the conservatives, like Secretary of State Seward, who favored leniency and gradual steps. On the flip side, you have the radicals, led by Treasury Secretary Chase, who are pounding the table demanding harsh measures and totally uncompromising action against the South. Lincoln himself naturally leaned a bit more conservative, but he was a master at smoothing over these huge egos, preventing walkouts, and miraculously keeping these two polar opposites functioning in his cabinet all the way until 1864.
All of that masterful political juggling paid off big time when he ran for re-election in 1864. Let me tell you, it was not an easy campaign. His party was fracturing, radicals were fighting him on Reconstruction, the war was dragging on, but Lincoln just rolled up his sleeves and acted as his own chief electoral strategist. He managed the Speaker's Bureau, advised the state committees, and made absolutely sure the soldiers fighting in the field actually got to cast their ballots. Ultimately, he secured a super decisive 55% popular majority. And the ultimate irony here? The Democratic candidate he soundly defeated was his old, overly cautious general, George B. McClellan. You really can't make that up.
Even as the war is finally winding down, Lincoln's trademark pragmatism is still front and center. He absolutely rejected any kind of rigid post-war dogmas. In fact, in his very last public speech, he explicitly warned that the situation was so unprecedented, you couldn't just apply an exclusive and inflexible plan for reconstructing the South. He was willing to be totally flexible, even suggesting they might temporarily use old rebel state governments if it meant transitioning to peace a little faster. On top of that, he was already publicly pushing the envelope, advocating for voting rights for newly freed African Americans, specifically pointing to those who had gallantly fought for the Union.
If you want to boil his entire approach down to one single idea, it's what he called having no policy. Now, don't get that twisted. It definitely didn't mean he lacked principles. The man had a profound, unshakable devotion to personal freedom and preserving the Union. What no policy really meant was radical adaptability. It was this absolute mental flexibility that kept him from falling into the traps of the outworn military dogmas that paralyzed his generals, and the entrenched political partisanship that constantly threatened to rip his government apart from the inside. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you pondering this. We just watched Lincoln build a modern war machine from scratch and wrangle some of the most stubborn personalities in American history. Did his complete lack of formal military training actually serve as his greatest superpower? Did it free him from the blinders of his era, giving him the ultimate advantage of pure, practical common sense over rigid dogma? It's a truly amazing question to think about when you step back and look at the sheer